All right. Okay, then welcome everybody. I would like to introduce you Professor Andrew McKechnie, who's a renowned zoologist at the University of Pretoria and holds the South African Research Chair in Conservation Physiology. So Professor McKechnie earned his PhD in 2002 in South Africa and then moved to the United States. We were just talking about this New Mexico for postdoctoral fellowship for 2 years, and then he returned to South Africa in 2004 to hold an academic position, and later joining his current institution in the University of Pretoria in 2008. He's a founding member of the South African Young Academy of Sciences and a founding researcher of the Hot Birds Research Project that he's going to talk about, which is a pioneering initiative investigating the limits of avian heat tolerance and proposing strategies to mitigate climate-related risks. He serves on boards of various leading scientific journals, and his accolades reflect his global recognition, including awards for scientific excellence and contributions to biodiversity conservation. His work focuses on understanding the physiological and ecological adaptations of desert birds to rising temperatures, and his research integrates cutting-edge physiology with conservation practices, addressing the threats posed by warming climate to biodiversity and ecosystems. And this is what he's going to talk about today, and this is with a great pleasure that I now turn the floor over to him, and please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew McKechnie.
Wonderful. Adam, thank you very much for the invitation to give this seminar, and thanks to everyone who's pitched up to listen to me. I'll do my best to keep you entertained for the next 45 minutes or so. So as is usually the case with a talk like this, I'm the one presenting the talk, but in reality, it's the work of a fairly large team of people. These are the team members of the Hot Birds Research Project. It's a program that spans 3 South African universities and a network of international collaborators. On the left here, this is a photo of the group in the Namib Desert in July 2019, and here last year in the Fynbos biome south of Cape Town. And there are a couple of people in these slides about whose research you're going to be hearing more in the next 45 minutes. Here's what I'm going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. I'll start by telling you about the work we've been doing on the upper limits of avian heat tolerance and evaporative cooling capacity. We've been working on that since 2012. I'm going to present this part of the talk in a comparative framework, focusing on how the avian capacity to handle acute heat exposures varies between and within taxa. I'll then move on and illustrate how this information about these upper thermal limits can be used to model the risks of lethal dehydration and lethal hypothermia during the extreme heat waves that are becoming increasingly frequent worldwide. These first 2 parts of the presentation will focus mainly on desert birds, and then in the third part of the talk, we'll move into more mesic environments, and I'll tell you some more about the novel and quite unexpected patterns of variation in avian heat tolerance that we're picking up there. I'll then finish off by talking about how the work we're currently doing and the impacts of humidity and how temperature and humidity interact to constrain avian performance in warm, humid environments. The setting for the first part of the talk is the world's hot deserts at subtropical latitudes. This is one of our study sites in the Northern Cape province of South Africa. At this particular site, the mean annual precipitation is approximately 100 millimeters per year, so a very arid area. In summer, air temperatures, the maximum air temperatures average somewhere around 37 degrees, sometimes make it into the lower 40s. On account of this dark red sand substrate, surface water is almost entirely absent. It simply soaks away. And the color of the sand means that surface temperatures may reach 70 degrees Celsius. It's not a very pleasant place to be doing field work in the middle of summer. And as you can see, there is not much here in the way of shade. Most of our work at this particular study site has focused on this species, the red lark. It's a range-restricted desert specialist confined to sand dunes and gravel plains in the Northern Cape province. If you're wondering what on earth is going on in this slide, a student I had working on red larks managed to habituate them to the point where you could get them to jump onto a scale in return for a small food reward, which allowed him to measure body mass early in the morning and late in the evenings. Despite these harsh conditions, red larks survive in this place without ever drinking. They're completely water independent, and they obtain enough water from a diet of insects and seeds in the winter months to eke out an existence. But let's make no mistake, this is a harsh environment, and these birds are living right on the edge. If you find yourself in this landscape on a summer's morning, initially the larks are very active, they're foraging, they're displaying. As the temperatures increase, somewhere around mid-morning, they just vanish. And where they disappear to is the shade of these shrubs. They're called driedoring, Afrikaans for three thorns. And this is the dominant plant species in this landscape. Now, this video I'm going to show you was obtained by one of my former PhD students, Reino Kemp, and he was able to obtain this footage on a very hot summer's day. The air temperature at the time he recorded this footage was 39 degrees Celsius. So there's a couple of things to notice here. This lark has scratched away the upper layer of the sand, has created a small hollow, and it's pressing its belly against the cooler sand a centimeter or two below the surface. It's periodically gaping to evaporate water, dissipate heat, and its eyes are closed most of the time, which I think is to minimize water losses across the moist surface of the corneas. But the takeaway message here is that this is a very tough place for a lark to live. And on a daily basis, they have to put a lot of effort into reducing heat gain, avoiding hypothermia and dehydration. And they do that by seeking shelter in the coolest spots they can find in this landscape. So now that I've introduced you to the sort of study systems we work in and an example of a study species, let's move on to thermal physiology, which of course is the main focus of this talk. Now, one of the fundamental properties of thermal performance curves is that even small increases in body temperature above optimum levels are associated with very rapid reductions in performance. And this phenomenon of even small increases in body temperature, causing catastrophic declines in physiological function, can be thought of as a thermal cliff. And during hot conditions, evaporative cooling becomes the only thing that prevents birds from falling off that thermal cliff. As soon as environmental temperature exceeds the bird's body temperature of about 40 degrees, you see this rapid increase in evaporative water loss rates. In this case, a 7-fold increase as environmental temperature increases from 40 to 48. In this bird, it's a small passerine from the American Southwest called the verdin. And what's really important to understand here is that under these intensely hot conditions, small birds like these verdins can be losing upwards of 5% of their body mass every hour via evaporative water loss. So in these hot environments, particularly when they're arid, birds face a fundamental trade-off between conserving body water, it's a desert after all, to avoid dehydration, versus dissipating heat evaporatively. So a trade-off between dehydration avoidance versus hypothermia avoidance. If we move on and place evaporative cooling in the context of a generalized model of avian thermoregulation based on the Scholander-Irving model, we see these linear increases in evaporative water loss starting typically just below the upper critical limit of neutrality, with gradual increases in body temperature starting at about the same point. So there's body temperature, evaporative water loss on this axis, resting metabolic rate over here. In terms of metabolic rate, so this diagram shows the classic Scholander-Irving curve. You've got your thermoneutral zone, and then above the thermoneutral zone, you see this steep increase in metabolic rate above the upper critical thermal limit. So this is what you see in most textbooks. But in reality, the slope of this increase, and indeed whether there's an increase at all above the thermoneutral zone, depends heavily on the primary avenue of evaporative cooling involved. So there are 3 major avenues of evaporative cooling in birds. panting, gula flutter, cutaneous evaporation. But the relative importance of these three avenues differs between different groups of birds. Panting, which involves forced ventilation of the thorax to increase rates of evaporative water loss, seems to be ubiquitous among birds. Main avenue of heat loss in songbirds or passerines, which represent 55% or so of birds on the planet, and also in groups like parrots and falcons. So these birds rely on panting. They don't possess the capacity for gula flutter or rapid cutaneous evaporation. Now, the thing with panting, and this is going to come up again during the talk, is that it's a relatively inefficient way of dissipating heat. And it's associated with these rapid increases in metabolic rate that you can see over here. So this pattern that you see here. Gula flutter, on the other hand, involves rapid pulsation of the hyoid apparatus to rapidly move those gula membranes. And many non-passerines possess the capacity for gula flutter. It's really well developed in things like nightjars. They rely almost entirely on gula flutter. And then last but not least, we've got cutaneous evaporation, which is simply evaporation across the skin. Not sweating, birds don't have sweat glands, and they evaporate water directly across the skin. Now, all birds have some degree of cutaneous evaporation simply because their skins are not waterproof. But in the pigeons and the doves, cutaneous evaporation has evolved into this highly efficient mechanism for heat dissipation. This little diagram at the bottom here is meant to illustrate the two ways in which doves and pigeons can adjust rates of cutaneous evaporation. They can adjust them over very short timescales, seconds to minutes, by altering hydrostatic pressure through the subcutaneous capillary beds. And they can also adjust their skin waterproofing over longer timescales by actually changing the lipid composition of the stratum corneum. That's what these diagrams are meant to show, to make the skin more or less waterproof. Okay, so evaporative cooling under hot conditions is something that's been of very long-standing interest to comparative physiologists. Early workers, including George Bartholomew, Knut Schmidt-Nielsen, Bill Dawson, their contemporaries, all generated a substantial body of data during the second part of the 20th century on evaporative cooling in birds. But if you take a closer look at these data, what you find is that there's a lot of variation between studies in terms of experimental conditions, particularly the humidities birds experienced while in metabolic chambers. So although we entered the 21st century with a pretty good understanding of the processes involved, large comparative analyses remained scarce. Back in 2011, Blair Wolfe at the University of New Mexico, Todd McWhorter at South Australia, and I secured an NSF grant to address some fairly fundamental questions by collecting data under standardized conditions from the arid zone avifaunas of three regions: the Sonoran Desert, the Kalahari Desert here in Southern Africa, and then the arid interior of Australia. The next couple of slides are all going to focus on this work, which we started in 2012 and which has been ongoing even though that NSF grant is behind us now. So our modus operandi has been something like this. We collect these physiological data at study sites like this one in the Northern Cape province of South Africa, where we set up field laboratories. So in this case, we were at a campsite where there was this nice prefab building. I think it was a converted container, and we set up a laboratory in there. We've got equipment, respirometry equipment that allows us to measure rates of evaporative water loss, metabolic heat production, body temperature over a range of environmental temperatures. Then we basically catch anything with feathers and measure these variables. This photograph in the middle, these are the injectable pit tags or microchips that we use to measure body temperature. These are the same as vets use for companion animals. The difference is they measure instantaneous body temperature. What we do during these measurements is we start runs at about 30 degrees Celsius. So we habituate the birds to 30 and then increase air temperature in 2-degree increments until they start showing signs of heat stress, indicated by loss of balance or sudden declines in evaporative water loss or metabolic rate. As soon as that happens, we end the run, put the birds in a cool environment, plenty of water to recover, after which we release them. And I should probably mention that in several cases, we've been able to monitor individuals for several weeks or even years post-release and have not found any indication of negative effects of this procedure. It's been approved by animal ethics committees in the US, in Australia, and here in South Africa. More recently, we've converted an off-road trailer into a mobile laboratory. This is one of my former students, Otto McCaller, collecting data in the mobile lab at a site in the arid west of South Africa. So that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years. For each species, we quantify relationships between air temperature on these x-axes and body temperature, evaporative water loss, and resting metabolic rate. Now, although these air temperatures to which we're exposing these birds, these are data for Birchall sandgrass, might seem extreme, they are generally within the range of operative temperatures the birds experience under natural conditions. So, you know, you've got 1300 watts per square meter of solar radiation on a day when the air temperature is 43, 44. For small birds anyway, that can mean operative temperatures 10 degrees or more above air temperature. So we're not really pushing birds outside of that range of operative temperatures that they would experience during extreme heat events. Okay, so after 10 years of doing this at various arid zone sites, we ended up with data for 56 species. And again, those span the American Southwest, Kalahari Desert here in Southern Africa, and arid Australia. These two graphs, so on both cases, the x-axis is log 10 body mass. And here, this top graph, these are the maximum body temperatures that the birds showed during measurements. So they're the body temperatures associated with the onset of severe hypothermia. For most songbirds, these maximum body temperatures are between 44, 45, maybe slightly above 45. And then for non-passerines, it's generally a bit lower. Lots of them are between 43 and 44. And then the Capring margarids just have these unparalleled heat dissipation capacities and just don't let their body temperatures go above 41, 42, 43. So there was no significant scaling that we could find for non-passerines. In the passerines themselves, there was weak negative scaling with body mass. Then this lower graph shows the heat tolerance limit reached by each species. So this is now the maximum air temperature associated with these maximum body temperatures. And the heat tolerance limits of passerines typically between 46 up to 52, one case of 54. Again, in non-passerines, you get higher heat tolerance limits for many groups. The Capring margarids, these red squares, the nightjars, these green triangles, a couple of other things. There's an owl somewhere in here as well. I think this is a spotted eagle owl up here. And so, yeah, the nightjars are just insane. I mean, you know, nightjars, one of the dove species, gets up into the lower 60s. In fact, we often have problems doing these runs because the equipment starts to fail before the birds show any sign of heat stress. At several recent extreme heat events in North America have involved air temperatures that approach or exceed the heat tolerance limits of many songbirds. And again, these are air temperatures we're talking about. So in June 2017, Phoenix International Airport experienced major disruptions when air temperatures exceeded the operating limits of many commercial airliners. In June 2008, Death Valley saw 3 consecutive days where the maximum reached 54 degrees, values that exceed the heat tolerance limits of all but one passerine for which we have data. And again, these are air temperatures we're talking about, so we're not even factoring in heat loads from solar radiation. So you can quite easily see how these extreme heat waves become really problematic for these birds. We've also used these data from those 56 arid zone species to take a closer look at the consequences of the different avenues of evaporative heat loss for heat tolerance. So this is a summary of the interactions between body temperature, evaporative water loss, resting metabolic rate, all its functions, environmental temperature. For a representative passerine, so this is the solid line here, a nightjar, the common purple from North America, that is this dotted line, and then a typical columbid, white-winged dove, again from North America. This is this dashed line here. So if we start by looking at the capacity of these different groups, or these groups that use these different pathways of evaporative cooling, if we look at their capacity to increase rates of evaporation above baseline levels, the picture that emerges is that this is approximately constant between groups. So this is simply the maximum evaporative water loss rates that they're capable of, expressed as a multiple of baseline thermoneutral evaporative water loss rate. And yes, the caprimulgids, as usual, are a bit weird, but for the most part, there's not significant differences. So these birds, as we've illustrated here, have a similar capacity to increase evaporative water loss above baseline levels. But what does differ dramatically across these taxa is the extent to which metabolic heat production increases at high environmental temperature. So for each species in the data set, we plotted the slope of this relationship between resting metabolic rate at high temperature and environmental temperature. And you can see here how the passerines have much steeper slopes compared to the columbids or the caprimulgids, and that's what we're really illustrating over here. So there's your typical songbird, there's a typical dove, there's a typical nightjar. I mean, these nightjars are just incredible. In several of them, we could not detect any statistically significant inflection in metabolic rate above the thermoneutral zone. There is no thermoneutral zone in these birds. And so this is the explanation for why, the explanation for why passerines, which rely on panting, generally reach their heat tolerance limit at a lower environmental temperature compared to your nightjars and caprimulgids that can make use of this far more efficient avenue of either gular flutter or cutaneous evaporation. Okay, we can also summarize these differences by plotting the maximum ratio of evaporative heat loss to metabolic heat production each species is capable of achieving. So a value of 1 means that birds can evaporate or dissipate 100% of metabolic heat production by evaporation. So passerines typically have quite modest values between about 1.5 and 2. So in other words, they can dissipate heat by evaporation at a maximum of 150 to 200%, the rate at which they're producing it. Doves and nightjars both emerge as pretty unusual taxa. So they both up again above the 2.53 range, going all the way up to 4 in the case of the doves, 5, even slightly higher in the case of the caprimulgids. Then in the non-passerines, I mean, this is a sort of, in the other non-passerine orders, this is kind of a dumping ground of a whole bunch of different orders, but we find quite large variation. And in fact, the highest evaporative cooling efficiency that we've documented so far is from a sandgrass, a Namakwa sandgrass that we studied in South Africa a couple of years ago. These guys get up right to 5.4, so losing heat by evaporation at 540% the rate at which they're producing it. So that, in a nutshell, is why some birds are much better than others at dealing with extremely high temperatures. And one of the implications of all of this is that the lower heat tolerance, the more modest evaporative cooling capacities of songbirds leads to the prediction that they are more vulnerable than many other taxa to death from hypothermia during extreme heat. And just keep that prediction in mind as we go through the next part of the talk. Okay, so that was the first part of the talk. I've taken you on a whistle-stop tour of avian evaporative cooling. I've spoken about how much physiological diversity we see in those traits, and we've sort of touched on some of the ecological implications. We can now move on to the second part of the talk, which is about using these physiological data for assessing species vulnerability to lethal effects of acute heat exposure during extreme heat events. Now, on extremely hot days, birds can succumb in one of two ways. The environmental temperatures might exceed their upper heat tolerance limits, or their cumulative evaporative cooling requirements may mean that their total water losses exceed their dehydration tolerance limits. So if they're able to lose water rapidly enough to avoid lethal hypothermia, they might subsequently get into trouble because they simply become lethally dehydrated. Now, historically, Australia has been the continent on which the most dramatic effects of extreme heat have been documented. Mass mortality events involving thousands of birds and bats. Although these events are not new, the frequency does seem to have increased in the last couple of decades, with mass die-offs of Australian flying foxes now featuring regularly in the news. So birds are involved. These are dead budgerigars, January 2009, dead carnabees, cockatoos, January 2010. And then among mammals, the fruit bats of the flying foxes, the giant pteropodid fruit bats, have been quite prominent in this as well. One of the most sobering examples of just what an extreme heat can do to a species involved 2 days of 42 degrees Celsius in northern Queensland in November 2018. And those 2 days wiped out 1/3 of Australia's entire population of spectacled flying foxes. It sounds insane. So let me just say that again. In 2 days, Australia lost 1/3 of its entire population of a particular species of flying fox due to extreme heat. So I always trot this example out when people tell me I'm being alarmist about the potential of extreme heat events to push species close to extinction. So in terms of the modeling work we've been doing, we started with species in the American Southwest. And before I carry on and explain to you what this map shows, I should just mention that all of the projections you're going to see in the next couple of slides are based on representative concentration pathways, 8.5 emission scenarios. So that's the kind of worst case business as usual carbon emission scenario for the rest of the century. So in both of these figures, what we've done here is we've plotted the US distribution of cactus wrens with this orange outline. We then used empirical data for each species, in this case cactus wrens, to model their cumulative water losses during the hottest 6 hours of each day during summer. So what our model assumes is that during the heat of the day, these birds are ceasing activity and they're resting in deep shade, conditions under which they're losing water by evaporation to keep cool, but not gaining it via foraging or drinking. Yes, they might have some water in their crop. We've taken that into account in some of our models. It doesn't really change the picture that much. So we calculate cumulative water losses during the hottest part of the day. And assuming cactus wrens can lose 15% of body mass as water before becoming lethally dehydrated, we then mapped the number of days per year or per summer on which these cactus wrens experience a significant risk of lethal dehydration under current conditions on the left over here, and under RCP 8.5 projections for the end of the century on the right. So under current conditions, there's some parts of Texas and Arizona, maybe Southern California as well, where the wrens experience a moderate risk of lethal dehydration on a couple of days a year. But fast forward to the end of the century, and the picture changes dramatically, and there are parts of Western Arizona, Southern California, stretching up into Nevada, where these birds are going to be experiencing that lethal dehydration risk on 50 to 60 days per year. Or in fact, they probably won't be, because I don't believe the species can persist under these conditions. And so I think there's going to be significant range contractions into the cooler parts of their range. If anything, this model is probably on the conservative side, as we're assuming birds have access to sites shady enough to completely shield them from solar radiation, which is often unlikely to be the case. And then by using species-specific data for multiple species, we can repeat that exercise for whole communities. This is all from the same 2017 study. The next region to which we turned our attention was here in South Africa, where my former PhD student, Shannon Conradi, did some fantastic work in this area for her MSc and PhD. When she ran similar models for Southern African species, a much more optimistic picture emerged. So for the 11 species for which we have data, only 3 are likely to experience a significant risk of lethal dehydration anywhere in their range by the end of the century. So, and, you know, typically 3 or 4 days, if that, you know, even in the sort of dramatic red spot for Burchell's starling, you're looking at 3 or 4 days. So very different pictures, very different numbers compared to the 50 or 60 days per year that we were seeing from the North American species. So that is the closest I'm going to come in this talk to giving you good news. So hold on to that, because it's only going to get more depressing from here. More recently, we conducted similar risk assessments for Australian species for which we have data. Now, these maps at first glance look similar to those for Southern Africa, but there's a key difference. So the upper end of the temperature scale for Southern Africa was 10 days per year, whereas for Australia, it's 100 days per year. So many of these species are going to lose significant parts of their range, particularly in northwestern Australia. It's simply going to become too hot for them to persist. And yeah, I mean, these zebra finches, we already have evidence that they are not present in this part of Australia in summer. They're there in winter, but not summer. Now, before moving on to my final example of a heat-related mortality event, I just want to share with you, give you some sense of what the climate has been doing here in South Africa in the last 2 decades. This figure shows weather data for a place called Tweerivieren, which is in the Kalahari Desert. And I got hold of weather data from the South African Weather Service going back to 1960s when a weather station was first installed here. And what I've plotted on this graph is the number of days above 35 degrees Celsius for each year. Now, I first visited the Kalahari as an 18-year-old schoolboy in 1992. And at that stage, the number of days hotter than 35 had averaged about 85 days per year. And that had been fairly stable for preceding decades. But then in the early 90s, things changed. And since then, we've seen this linear increase. This graph ends at about 2017, I think. But these days, we're looking at around 130 days per year. So essentially a 50% increase in the frequency of these hot days at this particular spot in the Kalahari Desert. Here is a similar data set for Skukuza, which is the main tourist camp in Kruger National Park, except in this case, its number of days above 40, not 35. And again, you can see relatively stable conditions into the 1990s. And in the last 2 decades, we're seeing these massive increases in the frequency of these very hot days, up to 24 days per year. When was this? 2018, I think it was. So we're seeing these rapid increases in the frequency of these very hot weather events. Against that backdrop, I want to very briefly tell you about an event that took place in eastern South Africa in November 2020 in a provincial park called Pongolo Nature Reserve. As you can see from the photo, it is not an arid habitat. This is a part of South Africa that usually gets about 800 millimeters of rain per annum. The elevation is about 150 meters. It's on the coastal plain adjacent to the Indian Ocean, which is maybe 100 kilometers from this particular reserve. Summers in this area are typically hot and humid, and the first half of November 2020 was no exception. These are simply the daily maximum air temperatures in the first half of November 2020, a couple of days in the upper 30s. And then on the 8th, the temperature at this weather station went up to 43 degrees. In the nature reserve itself, which is a few kilometers away and a bit lower down, it got to 45 degrees. And what I've done here in this top panel is plotted air temperature during those 24 hours. This is relative humidity. It peaked out at about 21% during the heat of the day. But what I do want you to notice is how air temperature remained above 40 for about 4 hours, maybe 5 hours on that day. After the worst of the heat, the rangers in Pongolo Nature Reserve started noticing dead birds on the ground. And they then went out and searched an area of 45 hectares, equivalent to about 1% of the reserve surface area. In that search area, they found 44 carcasses belonging to 13 species. Now, all but 3 of the carcasses were passerines. Now, you might remember that the heat tolerance limit of passerines is generally more modest than that of many non-passerine taxa. And so the predominance of passerines in this mortality event is consistent with what you'd expect based on this phylogenetic variation in birds' capacity to handle heat. The significance of this event, which also involved about 60 fruit bats, is that it was the first major heat-related mortality event involving wild birds documented here in Southern Africa. So for the members of the Hot Birds Research Project, this marked an incredibly concerning and very sobering milestone. Until November 2020, this had been the sort of thing that happened an ocean away in Australia. And now all of a sudden, it's happening on our doorstep here in Southern Africa. All right, now we can move into the third part of the talk, which focuses on adaptive variation in the upper limits of body temperature in birds. This part of the story starts with work by Per Scholander, Lawrence Irving, and their colleagues in the 1950s. They produced the Scholander-Irving model of endothermic homeothermy, which focused on metabolic rates and conductance, and later was expanded to include evaporative water loss. These early workers explored adaptive variation in metabolic rates and in thermal conductance, but they also concluded that body temperature was a non-adaptive constant. And I mean, as you can see from these quotes, they were pretty adamant that body temperature was not a trait that showed any adaptive variation. This early perception about body temperature set the scene for the next 7 decades of work on thermoregulation in endotherms. And during that time, most hypotheses about physiological adaptation focused on how selection acts on metabolic rates, evaporative water loss rates. And there are many papers on each of these variables that appeared during each decade. In contrast, comparative analyses of body temperature largely focused on scaling with body mass and to some extent variation across taxa. The notion that body temperature, like metabolic rates and evaporative water loss, is the target of selection is relatively new and unexplored. As the 2010s rolled around, a really neat idea emerged in the endotherm literature that endotherms show a similar continuum from thermal generalization to specialization, as is the case in ectotherms. So these authors hypothesized selection should act on endothermic body temperatures in much the same way it does on ectotherm body temperatures, even if the ranges of body temperatures involved are going to be quite a bit smaller in endotherms. And the next couple of years saw several experimental tests of this idea. And this is a really important concept to keep in mind as I tell you about the PhD that Mark Freeman completed 2 years ago under my supervision. Until Mark started his project, nearly all of our work on heat tolerance and evaporative cooling capacity had involved desert birds. And these are the major sites at which we collected data for those desert birds. What Mark did for his PhD one of his PhD chapters was to collect similar data at a montane site, altitude of about 2,000 meters above sea level, here near a town called Harrismith, and then also in humid coastal forests on the east coast of South Africa, next to the warm Orgulus current flowing south from the tropics. And at each of these sites, Mark collected heat tolerance and evaporative cooling data for about 20 species, using the same methods as we've used over the preceding decade for desert birds, and again involving very low chamber humidities. Now, our predictions was that maximum body temperature should be highest in desert areas, relatively modest in cool montane climates, and then also fairly high in humid lowland environments. And the basis for that prediction was some work that Wesley Weathers did back in the 1990s, where he looked at a couple of small granivores from Central America, Panama, if I remember correctly, and found quite unusually high maximum body temperatures in these birds. And he developed this very elegant hypothesis that birds in these humid environments, because humidity impedes their ability to keep cool by evaporation, have evolved pronounced hypothermia and pronounced tolerance of high body temperatures. Anyway, so back to Mark's project. These were some of the study species. The primary finding to come out of this part of Mark's PhD was some rather unexpected variation in both normothermic and maximum hypothermic body temperatures. There was variation between our sites, and unexpectedly, maximum tolerable body temperatures were lower, significantly lower among desert birds compared to at the montane site or at the humid rainforest site. So the exact reverse of what we had predicted. There was also significant variation, which we weren't expecting, in minimum normothermic. So this is the thermoneutral resting baseline body temperature, if you want. And unexpectedly, forest birds had significantly lower minimum normothermic body temperatures compared to desert or montane birds. As a consequence, the thermal safety buffer, the extent to which birds could increase their body temperatures above baseline levels before they got into trouble, was significantly larger for birds in these humid lowland forests compared to those in montane areas and in desert areas, which is a really cool finding. This finding of lower maximum body temperatures, more modest hypothermia tolerance, if you want, among desert birds is really surprising, because facultative hypothermia is a really powerful way to conserve water. And you'd certainly expect strong selection for water conservation in birds inhabiting desert environments. And this was the exact opposite of what we were expecting. We have very little idea what's going on here at this point, although I'm wondering if the relative expense of heat shock protein production isn't perhaps incompatible with the scarce, unpredictable energy availability for birds inhabiting desert environments. Sorry. So I actually have a postdoc who's working on this exact question at the moment. Nevertheless, arid zone birds do tolerate higher air temperatures under dry conditions compared to birds from these montane and lowland sites. So across sites, this pattern of variation in maximum tolerable body temperatures does not reflect heat tolerance limits, at least not under the dry conditions. So almost paradoxically, desert birds have more modest hypothermia tolerance, yet tolerate higher environmental temperatures compared to birds from these other two sites. Okay, so to summarize this third part of the talk, what Mark showed with this data set is that desert birds in Southern Africa tend towards thermal specialization with modest hypothermia tolerance, but with highly efficient evaporative cooling pathways that allow them to tolerate very high air temperatures under dry conditions. Birds from warm, humid lowlands, in contrast, have less efficient evaporative cooling pathways under standardized conditions, but have pronounced hyperthermia tolerance and show far more thermal generalization compared to arid zone species. So a very neat finding to come out from this comparison of birds occupying three different climatically different sites. That brings me to the fourth and the final part of the talk. And what we're going to talk about here, what we're currently focusing on in my lab, is the ways in which higher humidities affect heat tolerance limits and evaporative cooling capacity. The experimental manipulation of humidity can be a little bit challenging. It's taken us a while to get it right. And I suspect this is probably the major reason why relatively little work has been done in this area in the past. I am not going to bore you with our experimental setup, except to say that what we do for humidity measurements is we have three bubblers in series, one at a relatively high room temperature, the other at about 23 degrees. So we get that nice stream of saturated air at 23 degrees. And then we can regulate quite precisely the dew point of the air flowing into the chamber where the bird is. The other thing I'll just mention is that to get this right, we generally have to work in a room that is around 35 degrees Celsius, just to eliminate any possibility of condensation in the analyzers. So it's not particularly fun work. My students spend hours in these rooms at 35 degrees. just to do these humidity measurements. Going back to Mark's PhD work, so he was the first person in my lab who used this humidity technique. And what he did at those same 3 study sites, in addition to the data under dry conditions that you've already seen, he also collected data for around 10 species under humid conditions at each of those study sites. So he used a humidity of 19 grams of water vapor per cubic meter. It's equivalent to a relative humidity of 37% at 40 degrees Celsius. And these are some of the data that he collected here. What he did to develop this figure, he compared the heat tolerance limit, so the maximum tolerable air temperature under dry conditions, with the corresponding value for the same species under humid conditions. And what happens is that, as you would expect, elevated humidity causes that heat tolerance limit to drop because evaporative cooling is now compromised. And the hypothesis we tested was that among birds inhabiting humid lowland forests, that decrease in the heat tolerance limit should be smaller compared to birds in less humid habitats. In other words, we should see a smaller effect of high humidity among birds inhabiting those humid environments compared to those inhabiting drier environments. And as you can see, this is exactly what we found. So this is simply the difference between heat tolerance limit under humid conditions and heat tolerance limit under dry conditions. And these results supported our hypothesis. There's a significantly smaller reduction in heat tolerance limit associated with these humid conditions in our coastal lowland forest birds compared to our mountain birds or our desert sites. The other really important bit of information you need to know at this point is that we didn't see any differences between these 3 sites in terms of the effects of humidity on metabolic rates or evaporative water losses. So in other words, this effect here is reflecting the fact that these forest birds are allowing their body temperature to go higher up and tolerate higher body temperatures compared to birds from these less humid environments over here. Later, I want to show you, this is work that I did for a master's a couple of years back. She's frugivorous birds that live in forests. Again, was doing this work on the relationship between body temperature, evaporative water loss, EHL, MHP as a function of air temperature in the hornbills under 2 different humidity treatments. So the orange dots are under a humidity of 6 grams per cubic meter. It's equivalent to about 12% relative humidity at 40, and 13 grams per cubic meter, equivalent to about 25% relative humidity at 40. And as you can see from these patterns, this level of humidity didn't have a huge effect. We start seeing a slight reduction in the efficiency of evaporative cooling, slightly lower maximum values, but not a huge effect. But look what happens when we plot data for a really humid treatment, 25 grams, which is about 49% relative humidity at 40 degrees. Okay, the birds, these hornbills, although they're forest specialists, they've got a long evolutionary history with forests, but at this humidity level, their capacity to increase water loss is just destroyed. And at no point does their ratio of evaporative heat loss to metabolic heat production get anywhere close to 1. It doesn't even get above 0.4. So there's really strong effect of high humidity. And you can see that in the body temperature, because now all of a sudden, these birds are severely hypothermic compared to under dry conditions. One of the things we did here, and as far as I know, no one has done this before, we weight bulb temperature, so that measurement of temperature integrates humidity for these trumpet hornbills. And You normally see wet bulb temperature in the context of human safety, thermal comfort, the human maximum wet bulb temperature conditions, although there's recent evidence that it's probably. What we have done here is we've expanded this modeling. And so what we've done in these maps is across the Southern and East African range to maximum wet bulb temperatures of 31.7 degrees. So there's the current scenario. There's your color bar over there. You know, maybe under 10 days a year in some parts of the DRC and here in central Mozambique, particularly eastern Zimbabwe. This is the exposure under an RCP 4.5 scenario for the end of the century and an RCP 8.5 scenario for the end of the century. Because, of course, during the wet season, as air temperature increases, humidity is going to increase with it. And by the end of the century, these birds are going to be exposed to this maximum wet bulb temperature above which conditions are lethal for, in some cases, 50, 60, even closer to maybe 70 days per year in some parts of their range, particularly here in the Zambezi Valley in central Mozambique. And so this is really where we're going at the moment. We're kind of moving out of desert environments, and most of our main study sites at the moment are in humid forests. And we're aiming to collect data like this for quite a few forest species to see how that capacity to handle humidity varies taxonomically, what the consequences are going to be for avian biodiversity persistence in these humid habitats. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you today. These are the take-home messages. We've seen how there's substantial variation between taxa in heat tolerance and evaporative cooling capacity. We have passerines, which are pretty useless at tolerating high temperatures. We've got caprimulgets and doves that remain cool even when the air temperature is 60 degrees. We've seen from these modeling exercises how these risks of lethal effects of acute heat exposure are increasing rapidly. I've shown you how there's evidence for adaptive variation in maximum body temperatures in birds. And we've also seen how humidity seems to have acted as a selective pressure and driven the evolution of pronounced hypothermia tolerance and larger thermal safety margins. And the last thing I want to say is that it's really exciting to be involved in this kind of research. You know, I mentioned that this idea of adaptive variation in body temperature is a new idea. And so a lot of the questions that physiologists have spent the last 50 years answering for metabolic rates, evaporative water loss, there simply are no studies on body temperature. You know, and I think there's a really interesting historical aspect here. You know, most of the early work in this field was done by biologists in north temperate climates. And when they were looking for an extreme environment, they focused logically on deserts. And there's almost been this sort of underlying perception in the field of thermal physiology that tropical habitats are benign, physiologically unchallenging. But what we're starting to see now that we're actually going into these human environments and taking a look at what's going on there is a very different picture. And the physiological challenges of thermoregulation in these warm, humid environments are probably as great as in these very hot deserts. And the effects of rising temperatures, direct effects of rising temperatures, are probably going to be severe in both desert environments and humid rainforest type environments. And with that, I will finish by thanking the various organizations that have made this work possible over the last 15 or last 13 years, and thank all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this fascinating talk, although with some grim prospects for the futures, at least for the birds. Questions? Do we have questions from the audience? Yeah, Tamás.
Hey, hi, Andrew. Yeah, I'm Tamás. Yeah, I'm glad to be on the Hungarian and Debreceni University's emailing list. So nice to talk to you on cyberspace. So congratulations. This is a brilliant talk. It's a bit like listening political news, pretty much from every country in these days. But you know, yeah. So don't talk about this. I have two comments or questions. Now, the first issue is about the adaptation, and I'm just wondering whether is this different. You know, you study phylogenetic in very different species. They might have slight different mechanisms for coping with the heat stress. I'm thinking about the brain. The brain is actually super sensitive to temperature fluctuations. And a classic example of oryx and camels and so forth, mammals, which developed a specific mechanism to keep their brains cool. Are we seeing similar adaptations, maybe across different birds? And this is part 1A. 1B, whether this could actually help at least certain taxa to get out of this really grim future. I will have another question, but maybe just discuss this first. Thank you.
Look, the answer is yes. I mean, look, most birds investigated so far do maintain brain temperature anywhere between 0.5 degree and 3 degrees below core body temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's going to buffer them against increases in temperature, I don't think so. I mean, unless that reti ophthalmicum that's maintaining that gradient suddenly becomes a lot more efficient. I didn't have time to talk about it today, but a couple of years ago, we discovered crazy high body temperatures in a Southern African songbird called the red-billed quelea. I mean, to give you an idea, these birds, the average maximum body temperature across 20 individuals was 48.0 degrees. The highest individual temperature was 49.1, and we've subsequently had individuals making it up to 50. And I mean, those temperatures are unheard of in birds. So we're currently working on heat shock proteins in that species. I'm also hoping to find a student to look at brain cooling pathways in that same species I have my doubts, though, that brain cooling is going to be a silver bullet that allows birds to avoid the impacts of climate change, unfortunately.
So can I just continue? Yeah, thank you. Adam, can I continue?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, 1B. Sex differences. Are you seeing differences between males and females in certain species? Of course, this could be simply just a consequence of body size dimorphism. There might be. I remember in the 50s, there were some studies which did suggest that in quail, for instance, male and female heat tolerances are drastically different, and especially chicks. So I don't want to make this question more complicated. And sex difference, this is what we do a lot in shorebird, differences in early life, essentially, baby stage, and also in adults. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good question. It's not something that we've been looking into in any great detail. I mean, essentially what we've done, we've included sex as a predictive variable in the models for species where we can tell the sexes apart visually. I mean, we haven't sexed anything genetically or anything like that. And it hasn't emerged as significant in any of the species we've looked at so far, for which we have included it. What we have seen are sex differences in the effects of chronic exposure, not so much on thermoregulation, but on the ability of birds to maintain body condition during extended heat waves. You know, in the red larks, the males were much more severely affected by sustained hot weather than the females were. Why, we still don't know.
It would be worth to take a bit of blood sample and just PCR, and you get the sex very, very easily and very, very cheaply. One reason could be that in many songbirds, actually the females incubate. So if they happen to breed in an open and exposed temperature, we have actually a PhD student working on similar issues in shorebirds, then you would expect that the female will be a lot more stressed than the male, who can actually just hide away. And the opposite might be true in territorial maintenance. So when the males have to be out. So I think, biological sex, I think can be an important factor, put it gently. But thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I see there was a question in the chat box.
Yes.
I'm looking to read it.
Maybe, we can read it out loud. So currently temperatures are rising even in temperate regions, a phenomenon often linked to environmental destruction caused by technological development, resource exploitation, and population growth. Do you think we can develop sustainable strategies to mitigate climate change and conserve bird species, considering that our survival is dependent on resources?
Sure, that is not exactly a quick and easy question. In terms of whether we can develop sustainable strategies to mitigate climate change effects, given recent political developments in the United States, I'm no longer convinced. I think at the end of the day that, what we need to do is just start shifting conservation planning and protected area management to just accept the fact that we're dealing with novel climates. We're going to be dealing with climates that humans have no historical exposure to, that the birds alive today have no historical exposure to. And I mean, we're starting to see this already with threatened species, direct interventions to alter thermal environments, the provision of artificial shade, provision of artificial water. I mean, as you would know, Adam, the hornbill group has been working on nest boxes. The problem there is that a lot of the dead trees that the birds historically built nests in cavities, those trees are no longer there. And a lot of the natural nest cavities they do still have available are simply too hot. And so Lucy and her colleagues have been putting a lot of effort into designing artificial nest boxes using different construction techniques and materials to try and get artificial boxes that are cool enough. So I mean, that again is just an example of a conservation intervention for a specific threatened species. We currently have a student out at the Red Lark sites investigating whether they will use artificial shade if it's available in the landscape. And I think that kind of intervention is going to be quite important. In terms of conservation planning, I think it's not really happening in South Africa yet, but you need to start picking areas to conserve based on their future climates rather than their current climates. So I think at this point it's more about just adapting conservation strategies to accommodate pretty warm conditions in the next couple of decades.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I have a question which is partly related to Thomas's question about sex differences. So in some of these species, you can see like featherless skin parts, like in vultures or also in the ground, the hornbills, they have these parts. And I was wondering whether these actually can help with heat dissipation, because I would suspect that evaporation, is more efficient on these body parts. And related to Tamash's question, I was wondering about the brood patch, whether the brood patch actually can be helpful as a heat dissipation because there are no feathers on the brood patch.
I'd imagine it could be. Look, those thermal windows are, whether it's bare skin on the brood patch or on the neck or wherever, or even the bill. I mean, we know quite a lot now about heat dissipation across the bill. And those thermal windows are going to have an effect on heat dissipation, but only when environmental temperature is lower than body temperature. The moment environmental temperature goes above body temperature, those thermal windows are going to have the opposite effect. They're going to facilitate heat gain. The evidence so far suggests that feathers don't do very much to impede evaporative water loss. So at high temperatures, it's all about evaporative cooling.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? I might have a final question. I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to hold up the people. We need to close the session soon. But so what about nightjars? What are they so special? What are they so efficient? You mentioned that they're very efficient in heat dissipation. What is their trick?
It's gular flutter. It's a combination of gular flutter with this incredibly wide gape. And so they just have a much bigger surface area than most birds, over which to take advantage of evaporative heat dissipation by gular flutter. It's amazing. I mean, these things, metabolic rate shows no change. I mean, there is no thermoneutral zone in these nightjars because you have a lower critical limit of thermoneutrality, and then above that, the metabolic line is as flat as a pancake. I think they've evolved that because of their reliance on crypsis. The fact that they often, roosting, particularly when breeding in exposed locations. I had an American student, guy called Ryan O'Connor, working on them a couple of years back. And when the females are breeding, they go and pick roost sites in the middle of a open sand dune. There's no shade from sunrise to sunset. And so I think that was also, you know, selective pressure on the nightjars to develop really efficient evaporative cooling. But yeah, they are remarkable birds.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions. So if not, then I really would like to thank again Andrew for this very entertaining and interesting, exciting talk. And yeah, and with that, we can close the session. And thanks everybody for showing up. And then
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.